The rain had been falling for 48 hours straight, turning the streets of the city into slick, black mirrors that reflected the neon signs of the late-night diners and the flashing lights of passing patrol cars. I sat in a corner booth of a place called the Copper Kettle, staring at a stack of manila folders that held the life of a man who was scheduled to die in exactly 42 hours. The diner smelled of burnt filter coffee, industrial bleach, and the damp wool of coats left to dry over cracked vinyl booths. My eyes burned with a dry, scratching ache. I had been awake for 2 days, fueled entirely by the desperate, clawing need to find a single procedural error, a single suppressed document, anything that could halt the execution. The pages blurred together into meaningless shapes. The legal jargon felt like a foreign language I had forgotten how to speak. I rubbed my temples, pressing hard against the bone, trying to massage the impending migraine away before it could blind me. The bell above the door chimed, a sharp, cheerful sound that felt entirely out of place in the middle of the night. I did not look up. I expected it to be another exhausted cab driver or a night shift nurse seeking a brief sanctuary from the cold. But then the air in the room seemed to shift entirely. A cold draft swept in from the street, carrying with it the faint, sharp scent of expensive rain-washed wool and a subtle, warm, icy perfume that cut straight through the heavy smell of the grease. I looked up, my vision swimming for a fraction of a second before focusing. Asli stood in the doorway. She was the absolute last person I expected to see. She was the prosecutor assigned to crush my appeal. She was the state's newest, sharpest weapon, brought in from a high-rise corporate firm to ensure that my client met his end on schedule. She looked entirely out of place in the dingy diner. Her dark hair was perfectly sleek despite the torrential weather outside. Her tailored suit immaculate, her posture rigid and defensive. She scanned the room, her eyes calculating the dimensions, the exits, the occupants, before they finally landed on me. She did not hesitate. She walked over to my booth, her heels clicking against the linoleum floor, with a steady, rhythmic precision that sounded exactly like a ticking clock. She slid into the seat across from me without asking for permission. Was a mask of professional indifference? Was a mask of professional indifference, a wall of polished stone. "You are missing something," she said. Her voice was flat, devoid of any inflection, carrying the same clinical detachment she used when arguing motions in front of the judge. "You are looking in the wrong place. You need my help." I stared at her, at the sheer audacity of her words, taking my breath away. She was the one actively trying to kill my client. She was the one who had spent the last 2 days objecting to every motion I filed, dismantling every argument I made with a cold, ruthless efficiency that left me gasping for air in the courtroom. And now, she was sitting across from me, offering help. It had to be a trap. It had to be a psychological game designed to distract me, like to waste my remaining hours chasing a false lead while she secured her victory. I gathered my files, stacking them with trembling hands, shoving documents into folders without caring if they bent or tore. "I do not take help from the person holding the needle," I said, my voice hoarse and quiet, scraping against my throat. I shoved the folders into my battered leather briefcase, the brass clasps snapping shut with a final hollow sound. I stood up, refusing to look at her face. I refused to let her see how close I was to breaking, how the weight of the impending execution was fracturing my spine. I walked out into the freezing rain, leaving her sitting in the booth. I thought she had come to gloat. I thought she wanted to watch me drown in my own failure. The diner was exactly 22 feet wide and 40 feet long. The lighting was fluorescent, casting a sickly green pallor over the cracked vinyl booths and the grease-stained linoleum floor. Where I had walked 14 blocks in the freezing rain to get here, I did not take a cab because I needed the physical exertion to regulate my breathing, to force my lungs to expand and contract at a normal rhythm. My heart was beating at 110 beats per minute. My hands were entirely numb, though I could not tell if it was from the ambient temperature of the storm or the sheer, unadulterated terror coursing through my veins. Inside my structured leather briefcase, seated tucked perfectly between two blank legal pads, was a photocopy of a police ledger. A ledger that proved the lead detective in the state's case had manipulated the timeline of the murder by exactly 3 hours. A ledger that I had found buried in the digital archives 3 hours ago, mislabeled and hidden beneath layers of bureaucratic debris. A ledger that meant the man scheduled to be executed in 42 hours was innocent. I had spent my entire life building a career on precision, on following the rules, on winning by knowing the architecture of the law better than anyone else in the room. I had transitioned to the prosecutor's office to prove I could handle the highest stakes, to operate the machinery of justice without hesitation. And now, the state was asking me to facilitate a murder. I found Dilan sitting in the back corner of the diner. She looked like she was carrying the physical weight of the building on her shoulders. Her hair was falling out of a messy knot, while strands clinging to her damp forehead. Her eyes were bruised with a profound exhaustion, deep shadows carved beneath them, and her fingers were stained with dark ink from frantic note-taking. She was beautiful in a way that defied logic, in a way that made my chest tighten every time I looked at her across a crowded courtroom. I walked over to her. I sat down. I needed her to understand what I was holding. I needed her to take the ledger, to file the emergency motion, to save the man's life. Because if I did it myself, I would be disbarred, discredited, and destroyed by the very office I represented. I needed to hand her the sword so she could strike the blow. "You are missing something," I told her, trying to keep my voice steady, trying to suppress the violent tremor in my jaw. "You are looking in the wrong place. You need my help." I waited for her to look at me, really look at me, and see the panic in my eyes, the desperation hiding just beneath the surface of my skin. I waited for her to recognize that I was surrendering everything I had built. Instead, she looked at me with a profound, chilling disgust. "I do not take help from the person holding the needle," she said. The words hit me with the physical force of a blow to the ribs, knocking the air from my lungs. She packed up her things with frantic, angry movements. She walked out, leaving me alone in the fluorescent glare, the bell above the door chiming a mocking farewell. She thought I was a monster. She thought I was playing a cruel game. I sat there for 20 minutes, listening to the heavy rain hit the glass, wondering how we had fundamentally misunderstood each other, how two people looking at the exact same moment could see completely different realities. 72 hours earlier, the world had been a different shape. I was sitting in my cramped office on the 4th floor of the Public Defender's Building, surrounded by leaning towers of cardboard boxes that contained the tragic, broken histories of people the city had decided to throw away. The air conditioning was broken, as it always was in July, and a small, oscillating fan pushed warm, stale air across my desk. The phone rang. It was the director of the Capital Appellate Division. He told me that the final state appeal for a man named Kadir had been denied. The governor had refused clemency. The execution was scheduled for Friday night, at exactly 11 o'clock. We had 72 hours to file a federal habeas petition, to find a miracle in a 12,000-page record that had already been scoured by a dozen lawyers before me. I hung up the phone and stared at the wall for a long time. I had been doing capital defense work for 7 years. I had watched the system grind human beings into dust over and over again. Every time I took a case, I promised myself I would maintain a professional distance, that I would not let the horror of the impending death seep into my bones. And every time, I failed. I pulled the boxes down from the shelf and began to read. The case was a nightmare of circumstantial evidence, a convenience store robbery gone wrong, a single eyewitness with a history of shifting testimonies, and a defense attorney at the original trial who had slept through half the proceedings. It was the kind of case that made me want to scream until my throat bled. The next morning, I walked into the appellate courthouse for the emergency scheduling hearing. The courtroom was vast, paneled in dark oak, designed to make the individual feel small and insignificant beneath the crushing weight of the state. I took my place at the defense table, arranging my legal pads, trying to quiet the trembling in my hands. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the room swung open. The state's representative walked in. I had heard rumors about the new prosecutor. For the human cost. Asli walked down for the human cost. Asli walked down the center aisle, her posture impeccably straight, her dark suit tailored to military precision. She did not look at the gallery. She did not look at the empty jury box. She walked straight to the prosecution table, set down a single slim tablet, and folded her hands. She looked completely untouched by the gravity of the room. When the judge entered, she stood with perfect grace. When she spoke, her voice was clear, authoritative, and entirely devoid of emotion. She argued that the state had a compelling interest in finality, that the victims' families had waited 10 years for justice, and that my emergency motion was nothing more than a desperate, baseless delay tactic. She dismantled my legal arguments with a surgical precision that left me reeling. I looked at her profile, the sharp line of her jaw, the intense focus in her dark eyes, and I felt a surge of profound anger. How could someone be so brilliant and so entirely devoid of empathy? How could she stand there and argue for the termination of a human life with the same detached competence she might use to argue over a contract dispute? I hated her in that room. I hated what she represented. I hated the flawless, impenetrable armor she wore. My assignment to the case had come via an email sent at 6 o'clock in the morning, 72 hours before the scheduled execution. The subject line was simply the case number. The body of the email contained a single directive from the district attorney: ensure the execution proceeds, no further delays. I sat in my corner office with its sweeping view of the city skyline, a view I had earned by billing 80-hour weeks at a corporate firm before deciding I wanted to work inside the actual machinery of the government. I opened the digital file. It was massive, a sprawling labyrinth of transcripts, forensic reports, and appellate rulings. I approached it the way I approached everything, as a puzzle of logic and precedent. My job was not to determine guilt or innocence. My job was to defend the integrity of the prior convictions, to ensure that the procedural rules had been followed, to protect the state's final judgment from being unraveled by technicalities. I spent the day building a fortress around the conviction, anticipating every possible angle of attack the defense might use. The next morning, I entered the appellate courtroom. The space was mathematically imposing, the ceiling exactly 30 feet high, the acoustics designed to amplify the voice of the judge and diminish the voices of the petitioners. I walked to the prosecution table. I placed my tablet perfectly parallel to the edge of the wood. I looked across the aisle at the defense attorney. Dilan. I had read her filings. They were passionate, deeply researched, and practically vibrating with moral outrage. Seeing her in person was a strange experience. She looked exhausted, her posture defensive, her hands restless as she arranged her notes. She wore a blazer that was slightly frayed at the cuffs, a stark contrast to the sterile perfection of the courtroom. When the judge asked her to state her case, her voice trembled for a fraction of a second before finding its strength. She spoke about human dignity, about the catastrophic failures of the original trial counsel, about the inherent cruelty of the ticking clock. She was magnificent. She was fighting a losing battle against a heavily fortified wall, and she was doing it with a desperate, beautiful ferocity. When it was my turn to speak, I stood up and did exactly what I had been trained to do. I stripped the emotion from the room. I cited precedent. I pointed out the procedural defaults in her petition. I argued for finality. I kept my voice perfectly level, ensuring that my tone conveyed absolute certainty. I did not look at Dilan while I spoke, because I knew that if I looked into her eyes, I might lose the thread of my argument. I could feel her anger radiating across the aisle, a palpable heat that made the back of my neck prickle. She thought I was a machine. She thought I cared only about winning. She did not know that I had spent the entire night reading the original trial transcripts, and that a tiny, persistent voice in the back of my mind had started whispering that something in the timeline did not add up. I pushed the voice down. I did my job. I sat down, victorious, and felt entirely hollow. The hearing ended in a brutal, predictable defeat. The judge denied the stay of execution, giving me 24 hours to file an appeal with the higher court. I packed my briefcase with angry, jerky movements. I walked out of the courtroom, my vision blurring with tears of frustration that I refused to let fall. I pushed through the heavy wooden doors and out into the vast, echoing marble hallway of the courthouse. I leaned against the cold stone wall, pressing the heels of my hands into my eyes, trying to stop the world from spinning. The sound of sharp, rhythmic footsteps approached. I dropped my hands and opened my eyes. Asli was walking toward me, her briefcase swinging slightly at her side. She stopped a few feet away. The hallway was empty, the silence stretching between us like a physical barrier. She looked at me, her expression unreadable, her dark eyes entirely still. I expected her to walk past me. I expected her to ignore my existence entirely, now that she had won the round. But she stopped. "The case is not strong enough," she said, her voice echoing slightly in the empty corridor. "You are focusing on the ineffective assistance of counsel. The appellate courts have already rejected that argument 3 times. You are going to lose." I stared at her, the sheer arrogance of her statement making my blood boil. She was giving me legal advice on how to save the man she was trying to kill. "This is not a competition," I said, my voice shaking with barely suppressed rage. "This is a human life. We are talking about killing a man entirely based on the testimony of a witness who was legally blind without his glasses." Asli did not flinch. She simply adjusted her grip on her briefcase. "It is all a competition," she replied, her tone perfectly even, devoid of any malice or triumph. "The law is an adversarial system. If you do not treat it as a competition, you will be crushed by those who do." I looked at her, searching for a crack in her armor, a flicker of doubt, a sign that she understood the magnitude of what we were doing. I found nothing, just a smooth, impenetrable surface. "For you, maybe," I whispered, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. I turned and walked away, my footsteps echoing down the long marble corridor. I felt a profound sense of isolation. I was fighting against a machine, and Asli was its most perfect, terrifying component. I went straight to the basement archives. I had to find something else. If the ineffective counsel argument was dead, I needed a new angle. I needed to find the crack in the foundation of the state's case. The judge ruled in my favor. The stay was denied. The execution remained on schedule. I packed my tablet and walked out of the courtroom. The marble hallway was brightly lit, the afternoon sun streaming through the high windows, casting long, geometric shadows across the floor. I saw Dilan standing against the wall, her hands pressed over her eyes. She looked entirely defeated, her shoulders slumped, her breathing shallow and uneven. I should have walked past her. The rules of professional conduct, the unwritten laws of the prosecutor's office, dictated that I should return to my desk and begin preparing for the final appellate response. But my feet stopped moving. I stood 3 feet away from her, watching the way her chest rose and fell. I wanted to tell her that her argument had been brilliant, that her passion was the only thing in the courtroom that felt real. I wanted to tell her that I was terrified by the inconsistencies I had noticed in the original police reports. Instead, my training took over. My brain categorized the interaction as a tactical exchange. "The case is not strong enough," I said. "You are focusing on the ineffective assistance of counsel. The appellate courts have already rejected that argument 3 times. You are going to lose." I said it because I wanted her to pivot. I wanted her to look closer at the evidentiary timeline. I was trying to guide her without violating my oath. I was trying to give her a map. She looked at me with a fury so pure and intense, it made me take a microscopic step backward. "This is not a competition," she said, her voice vibrating with anger. "This is a human life." She thought I was gloating. She thought I was treating the impending execution as a game to be won. I felt a sudden, sharp ache in my chest, a physical manifestation of the distance between my intention and her perception. "It is all a competition," I replied, because it was the only truth I knew how to articulate. The system was designed to be a war. If she did not fight it like a war, she would lose the life she was trying to save. I needed her to be ruthless. "For you, maybe," she whispered, her eyes filled with a devastating disappointment. She turned and walked away. I watched her disappear down the corridor. I had tried to give her a signal, a warning, and I had delivered it in a language she found entirely repulsive. I returned to my office. I locked the door. I pulled up the digital archives. I began to pull the thread I had warned her about, the timeline of the primary witness. I needed to know if the state was about to make an irreversible mistake. The basement archives of the central courthouse were a subterranean maze of metal shelving units, smelling of dust, decaying paper, and damp concrete. I spent 12 hours down there, surrounded by boxes of physical evidence and original trial transcripts that had not been digitized. The fluorescent lights buzzed with a relentless, maddening hum. I was looking for the original police notes regarding the primary witness, a man named Yilmaz, who had placed my client at the scene of the crime. The defense at trial had never cross-examined him on his timeline. I pulled a massive, dust-covered box from the top shelf. It was heavy, the cardboard soft with age. I carried it to a small metal table under a flickering light. I began to sort through the manila envelopes. Hours bled into one another. My vision blurred. I drank stale coffee from a thermos and ate nothing. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I heard the heavy metal door of the archive room groan open. Footsteps echoed on the concrete floor. Slow, deliberate, precise. I did not need to look up to know who it was. The scent of that icy perfume preceded her. Asli walked down the narrow aisle between the shelving units. She was wearing a different suit, this one a dark charcoal, her white shirt perfectly pressed. She stopped at the end of my table. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my voice harsh, breaking the heavy silence of the room. "This is the Defense Archive section. The state's files are digitized." Asli looked at the mountain of paper spread across my table. I am verifying the chain of custody for the physical evidence," she said, her tone smooth and unbothered. "The digital scans of the original intake forms are illegible." She walked past me, moving toward the very same section of shelves I had just pulled my box from. I watched her. She reached up, her sleeve pulling back slightly to reveal a silver watch, and pulled down a box labeled with the precinct number from the night of the murder. She carried it to the opposite end of the long metal table. We sat in silence for 2 hours. The only sounds were the rustling of paper and the hum of the lights. It was an intimate, suffocating silence. I could feel her presence at the end of the table like a gravitational pull. Every time she turned a page, my eyes flicked toward her. I wondered what she was looking for. I wondered if she was trying to find a way to preempt my next motion. At one point, we both reached for the same master index file that sat in the center of the table. Our fingers brushed. Her skin was freezing cold. She pulled her hand back instantly, as if I had burned her, her jaw tightening. She slid the file toward me without a word. I took it, my heart hammering against my ribs. She was so guarded, so entirely closed off, that even a momentary physical contact seemed to offend her. I hated the way my hand tingled where she had touched it. I hated that in the middle of a fight for a man's life, I was hyper-aware of the way she breathed. We're a disaster of organizational methodology. The humidity levels were entirely unregulated, compromising the integrity of decades-old paper. I descended the concrete stairs, the air growing colder and heavier with every step. I had spent the last 8 hours cross-referencing the digital timelines, and I had found a gap. A 3-hour discrepancy between the time the witness claimed to have called the police and the time the police ledger recorded the call. If the ledger was accurate, the witness could not have seen the murder. But the digital scan of the ledger was cut off at the margins. I needed the physical book. I opened the heavy metal door. The room was dimly lit, shadows stretching aggressively across the floor. Dilan was sitting at a metal table in the center of the room, to keep her client alive. I walked down to keep her client alive. I walked down the aisle. Her head snapped up. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her voice sharp and defensive. "This is the Defense Archive section." I maintained my neutral expression, suppressing the urge to tell her the truth. "I am verifying the chain of custody for the physical evidence," I said. "The digital scans of the original intake forms are illegible." It was a lie. I was looking for the precinct ledger. I walked past her, acutely aware of her eyes tracking my movements. I pulled the box containing the precinct records from the shelf. I sat at the far end of the table. The silence between us was heavy, thick with unspoken accusations and a strange, vibrating tension. I opened the box and began carefully extracting the fragile bound books. I was hyper-aware of her every movement. The way she sighed, the way she rubbed her eyes, the sound of her pen scratching furiously against her legal pad. I wanted to close the distance between us. I wanted to tell her what I suspected. But I had no proof yet, and to speak without proof was to risk everything. I reached for the master index file in the center of the table at the exact moment she did. My fingers brushed against hers. Her skin was warm, a sudden shocking contrast to the freezing temperature of my own hands. The contact sent a jolt of electricity straight up my arm. I pulled my hand back instinctively, terrified that she would feel my pulse racing. Terrified that the physical contact would shatter the carefully constructed wall I maintained between us. I clamped my jaw shut, fighting for control. I slid the file toward her, unable to meet her eyes. I saw her expression harden, interpreting my withdrawal as disgust. She took the file and turned away. I stared at the open ledger in front of me, my vision swimming. I found the date of the murder. I scanned down the columns. There it was, the original uncropped entry. The witness had called at 2 a.m, not 11 at night. The timeline was a fabrication. The state's case was built on a lie. I stared at the ink until it burned into my retinas. I had found the truth, and it was going to destroy my career, as I left the archives empty-handed. The index file had led to a dead end. The original police notes I needed were missing from the box, signed out 5 years ago and never returned. I walked out of the courthouse into the fading light of the evening. I had 36 hours left. Panic was no longer a distant threat. It was a physical entity sitting on my chest, making it impossible to draw a full breath. I went back to my office and began drafting a desperate, would tear it apart in minutes. I worked, would tear it apart in minutes. I worked until midnight, my brain misfiring, the words on the screen losing all meaning. I needed coffee. I needed a change of environment before I lost my mind entirely. I left the office and walked through the driving rain to the Copper Kettle. I took my usual booth in the back. I spread my files across the table. I stared at the name of my client, Kadir. A man who had maintained his innocence for 10 years. A man who had looked at me through the reinforced glass of the visitation room and told me he was tired of fighting. I was failing him. The system was too big, too entrenched, too completely indifferent to the truth. And then the bell above the door chimed, and Asli walked in. I watched her approach my table. I watched her sit down. I listened to her tell me I was missing something, that I was looking in the wrong place, that I needed her help. I looked into her dark, perfectly composed eyes, and I saw nothing but a trap. I saw a prosecutor who had realized I was close to breaking and wanted to ensure I wasted my final hours chasing shadows. I saw the embodiment of the machine that was going to kill my client. I told her I did not take help from the person holding the needle. I packed my bag. I walked out into the rain. I walked for 6 blocks before the exhaustion finally overtook me. I leaned against a brick wall in a dark alleyway, the rain soaking through my coat, and I wept. I wept for Kadir. I wept for the impossibility of justice. I wept because I was entirely, hopelessly alone. I went back to my office. I finalized the week petition. I filed it electronically at 4 a.m. I slept on the floor of my office, my coat pulled over me like a shroud. I woke up 3 hours later to an email notification. The final hearing was scheduled for 2 p.m. It was the end of the line. We were going to the Supreme Court of the state, and I had nothing left to say. I sat in the diner for 20 minutes after Dilan walked out. The coffee on the table grew cold, a thin film forming on its surface. The ledger copy in my briefcase felt like a radioactive isotope, burning through the leather, burning through my conscience, and I had tried to give it to her. I had tried to let her be the hero, to let her save her client, while allowing me to maintain some semblance of deniability. But she had refused. She had looked at me with absolute hatred and walked away. I understood why. I had built a persona of unyielding, ruthless efficiency, and I had worn it so perfectly that she could not see the human being trapped inside it. I left the diner and walked back to my apartment. The city was silent, the rain washing the streets clean. I sat on my immaculate minimalist sofa in the dark. I took the photocopy out of my briefcase and laid it on the glass coffee table. I had a choice. I could destroy the paper. I could go to the final hearing tomorrow, argue the state's case, secure the execution, and continue my meteoric rise within the district attorney's office. No one would ever know. The missing 3 hours in the timeline would remain buried in the basement archives forever. Or, I could stand up in open court and present the evidence myself. I could sabotage my own case. I could violate the fundamental directive of my employment. I would be fired immediately. I would likely face a disciplinary hearing from the Bar Association. My career as a prosecutor would be over before it had truly begun. I sat in the dark for 6 hours, watching the rain streak the windows, watching the city slowly turn gray with the approaching dawn. I thought about the geometry of the law. I had always believed that the rules were the only thing separating civilization from chaos. But what happens when the rules are manipulated to produce a mathematically perfect murder? What happens when the architecture of justice is built on a lie? I thought about Dilan. I thought about the desperate, beautiful ferocity in her eyes when she fought for a life. I thought about the way she had looked at me in the hallway, telling me it was not a competition. She was right. It was not a game. It was a man's life. At 7 in the morning, I stood up. I went to my bathroom and washed my face. I put on my sharpest, darkest suit. I placed the photocopy of the ledger into a fresh manila folder. I left my apartment and walked to the courthouse. The final hearing was scheduled for 2 o'clock. I was going to burn my career to the ground, and I was going to do it in front of the entire appellate bench. The Supreme Courtroom was the grandest space in the building, a cavernous chamber of marble and mahogany dominated by the elevated bench where the 5 justices sat. The gallery was packed with reporters, law students, and the family of the victim. The air was thick, suffocating, heavy with the absolute finality of the moment. We had 8 hours left until the execution. I sat at the defense table, my hands folded tightly in my lap to hide their shaking. I had nothing left. My petition was a hollow shell of desperate arguments. I looked across the aisle. Asli was sitting at the prosecution table. She looked exactly as she always did. Perfectly composed, untouchable, a statue carved from ice. She was reviewing her notes, her eyes scanning the tablet with rapid, mechanical precision. When the Chief Justice called the court to order, the room fell into a terrifying silence. I stood up. I walked to the podium. I delivered my argument. I spoke for 20 minutes, my voice echoing in the massive chamber. I pleaded for mercy. I pointed to the unreliability of the eyewitness. I begged the court to recognize the irreversible nature of the punishment. But I could see it in their eyes. The justices were completely unmoved. They had heard it all before. They asked no questions. They simply stared at me with polite, lethal indifference. I finished my argument and returned to my seat, my legs barely supporting my weight. The Chief Justice turned his gaze to the prosecution table. "Counsel for the state," he said. his voice booming through the microphones. "You may proceed." Asli stood up. She did not take her tablet to the podium. She took a single manila folder. She walked to the center of the room. She stood before the 5 justices, her posture perfectly straight, her shoulders squared. She opened the folder. "May it please the court?" she began, her voice ringing out clear and perfectly steady. "The state has a compelling interest in finality, but the state has a higher, absolute mandate to ensure the integrity of its convictions." She paused. The courtroom was so quiet I could hear the hum of the air conditioning vents. I stared at her back, confusion warring with the crushing despair in my chest. Asli looked down at the paper in her folder. At 3 o'clock yesterday afternoon, while reviewing the physical archives to verify the chain of custody, I discovered a discrepancy in the primary evidentiary timeline. She pulled the photocopy from the folder and held it up. "This is a copy of the original precinct ledger from the night of the murder. It indicates that the primary witness, Yilmaz, contacted the police at 2 o'clock in the morning. The state's entire timeline at trial was predicated on his testimony that he witnessed the crime at 11 o'clock at night. The witness could not have seen the murder. The timeline is a physical impossibility. The original trial prosecutors suppressed this ledger." The courtroom erupted. The reporters in the back row began whispering frantically. The Chief Justice slammed his gavel down, his face entirely red. "Counsel," he barked, leaning over the bench. "Are you presenting evidence that directly contradicts your own case? Are you petitioning against the state?" Asli did not flinch. She stood her ground, a solitary pillar of absolute defiance. "I am submitting this evidence to the court as an officer of the law," she said, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "The conviction is fundamentally flawed. If the state proceeds with this execution, it will be committing state-sanctioned murder. Therefore, the state joins the defense in requesting an immediate, indefinite stay of execution and petitions for a full evidentiary hearing to vacate the conviction." I sat frozen in my chair. The breath had entirely left my body. I stared at Asli, the world tilting violently on its axis. She had done it. She had found the truth. And she had just thrown herself onto the sword to save my client. She had destroyed her own case, her own career, in front of the highest court in the state. I looked at her profile. Her jaw was clenched, but her eyes were perfectly, beautifully calm. She was not a machine. She was the bravest person I had ever seen. The chaos in the courtroom was immediate and deafening. The Chief Justice was shouting. The other justices were furiously reviewing the digital copies of the ledger I had uploaded to the court system 5 minutes prior, and the gallery was a sea of noise. I stood at the podium, perfectly still, letting the storm rage around me. I felt a strange, profound sense of peace. The crushing weight that had been sitting on my chest for 3 days was gone. I had broken the rules. I had betrayed my office. I was going to face catastrophic professional consequences. But for the first time since I entered the legal profession, I knew with absolute crystalline certainty that I had done the exact right thing. The Chief Justice hammered his gavel until the wood nearly splintered. "Order!" he roared. "Order in this court!" The room slowly fell silent, the tension thick enough to choke on. The justices conferred in hushed, urgent whispers for 3 agonizing minutes. Finally, the Chief Justice turned back to the microphone. In light of the newly presented evidence and the extraordinary nature of the state's concession, this court grants an immediate stay of execution. The matter is remanded to the lower court for a full evidentiary hearing regarding the alleged prosecutorial misconduct. We are adjourned. The gavel fell. The sound echoed like a gunshot. I closed my manila folder. I turned away from the bench. I looked at the defense table. Dilan was staring at me. Her eyes were wide, filled with a mixture of absolute shock, overwhelming relief, and something else. Something deep and searching that I could not quite parse. I wanted to go to her. I wanted to tell her that she had been right, that it was not a game, that human life mattered more than the architecture of the system. But the doors at the back of the courtroom swung open, and my supervisor, the district attorney himself, marched in. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. He pointed a trembling finger at me. "My office." "Now," he hissed, before turning on his heel and marching out. I looked back at Dilan one last time. I gave her a microscopic nod, a silent acknowledgement. Then I walked down the aisle, the sea of reporters parting for me, and walked out to face my execution. The next 3 hours were a blur of screaming, threats, and slammed doors. I was fired immediately. I was told I would be reported to the ethics committee. I packed my office in silence, placing my framed degrees and my favorite pens into a single cardboard box. I walked out of the building just as the sun was beginning to set, casting a golden, bruised light over the city. I stood on the pavement, holding my box, entirely untethered. I had no job. I had no future in the prosecutor's office. I had nothing but the cold, clean air in my lungs. I ran out of the courthouse, my heels slipping on the wet pavement, my eyes scanning the crowds of people rushing to get home. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the city smelling of ozone and wet asphalt. I had spent the last 3 hours frantically coordinating with the prison, ensuring the warden had received the official stay order, calling Kadir's mother, crying on the phone with her as she screamed her thanks to God. But my mind was entirely consumed by Asli. I had to find her. I had to understand what she had done. I saw her standing on the corner of the street, a block away from the district attorney's office. She was holding a small cardboard box. She looked entirely out of place, stripped of her armor, standing on the sidewalk like a civilian. I ran toward her, my breath catching in my throat. "Asli!" I called out. She turned. When she saw me, her posture stiffened defensively, her grip on the box tightening. I stopped 2 feet away from her, my chest heaving. The streetlights flickered on above us, casting long shadows across her face. "Why did you do it?" I asked, the question tearing out of me. "You had the case won. You had the promotion. You had everything. Why did you burn it down?" She looked at me, her dark eyes completely steady, completely devoid of the clinical detachment she had worn in the courtroom. "Because it was wrong," she said. The words were simple, quiet, and carried the weight of an absolute truth. I stared at her, the memory of our conversation in the diner rushing back to me. "You tried to give it to me," I whispered, the realization hitting me with the force of a physical blow. "Last night, at the diner, you had the ledger. You tried to give it to me so I could file the motion." Asli nodded slowly. "I did, but you told me you do not take help from the person holding the needle." I felt a wave of profound, sickening guilt wash over me. I had misread her entirely. I had looked at her fear and seen arrogance. I had looked at her attempt to save a life and seen a cruel trap. I had been so blinded by my own self-righteousness, so convinced that I was the only one fighting for justice, that I had completely failed to see the incredible courage of the woman standing in front of me. "I am so sorry," I said, my voice breaking. I am so incredibly sorry. I didn't see you. I didn't see what you were doing. Asli shifted the box in her arms. A faint, sad smile touched the corner of her mouth. It is fine, Dilan. We were speaking different languages. The system trains us to see enemies. You saw what you were trained to see. She turned to walk away. Panic seized me. I reached out and caught her arm. Her coat was damp, her arms solid beneath the wool. Please, I said, desperate to keep her from disappearing into the city. Please let me buy you a coffee. Let me help you carry your box. Let me try to speak your language. Asli looked down at my hand on her arm, then up into my eyes. For the first time, the wall between us completely dissolved. I saw the exhaustion, the fear, the brilliant, terrifying intellect, and the deep, hidden warmth beneath it all. I would like a coffee, she said softly, but not from the copper kettle. Their filter coffee is a crime against humanity. I let out a startled laugh, a sound that felt like sunshine breaking through a storm. I smiled at her, my heart hammering a new, terrifying rhythm against my ribs. I know a better place, I said. I took the box from her hands. We walked down the street together, the shoulder to shoulder, leaving the courthouse behind us. 6 months later, the city was buried under a thick blanket of January snow. The air was crisp, the sky a brilliant, blinding blue. I sat in my new office. It was not a corner suite with a view of the skyline. It was a modest, 2-room space above a bakery, smelling constantly of rising yeast and cinnamon. After the district attorney fired me, the ethics board had reviewed the case, thanks to a massive, relentless public defense campaign spearheaded entirely by Dilan, who had rallied every civil rights organization in the state to my defense. My license was preserved. I had opened an independent legal consulting firm, specializing in appellate procedural reviews. I was my own boss. I played by my own rules. My phone buzzed on the desk. I picked it up. It was a text message from Dilan. Did you read the brief I sent over last night? I smiled, leaning back in my chair. Dilan and I had established a new rhythm. She was still at the public defender's office, still fighting the impossible wars. But now, before she filed her major appeals, she sent them to me. I would review them, dismantle them, point out the structural weaknesses, and she would rebuild them stronger. We were no longer on opposite sides. We were two halves of the same engine. I typed my reply. I finished reading it at 3 a.m. Your argument on page 42 regarding the chain of custody is structurally unsound. The precedent you cited was overturned in 2014. I hit send. 3 seconds later, she replied. You are a monster. I laughed out loud, the sound echoing in the quiet office. I typed back, I am accurate. Accuracy is love. I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the send button. It was a bold statement, a shift from the professional banter we usually maintained. I took a breath and pressed send. I watched the 3 little dots appear on the screen, indicating she was typing. The dots vanished. They appeared again. They vanished. Finally, a message came through. I know. Are we still on for dinner tonight? I smiled, a deep, settling warmth spreading through my chest. Yes, 7 o'clock. Do not be late. I put the phone down and looked out the window at the falling snow. I had lost the career I thought I wanted. I had lost the armor I thought I needed. But I had found something infinitely better. I had found the truth, and I had found her. I sat at my crowded desk in the public defender's office, staring at my phone, a massive, foolish grin stretching across my face. Accuracy is love. It was the most entirely Asli thing anyone had ever said in the history of the world. 6 months ago, I would have read that sentence and thought she was mocking me. I would have thought she was a cold, calculating machine. But now, I knew exactly what it meant. It meant she had stayed up until 3 in the morning reading my work because she cared about it. It meant she was protecting my blind spots. It meant she was looking out for me in the only language she knew how to speak perfectly, the language of precision. I looked around my office. The leaning towers of cardboard boxes were still there. The broken air conditioning was still there. The impossible crushing weight of the system was still there. But I was no longer carrying it alone. I had an ally. I had a partner. I had a woman who had burned her own life down to prove that the truth mattered more than winning. The snow was falling heavily outside my window, coating the ugly concrete of the city in a soft, forgiving white. I thought about the night we had almost missed each other entirely. The night in the diner, the rain lashing against the glass, the two of us sitting across from each other, separated by a chasm of fear and misunderstanding. I had thought she was my enemy. She had thought I was unreachable. We had both been completely honest, and we had both been entirely wrong. But we had found our way back. We had learned to read the spaces between the words. I picked up my pen and turned back to the brief, flipping to page 42. I crossed out the overturned precedent. I began to rewrite the argument, building it stronger, building it better, building it with the exact structural integrity she had taught me to use. The clock on the wall ticked toward the evening. I had a dinner date at 7 o'clock. And for the first time in my life, I was absolutely certain that I was exactly where I was supposed to be, fighting the right war, side by side with the right person.